Something that surprises quite a lot of people is that even if garden owners are not specifically gardening for wildlife, gardens themselves are pretty good for wildlife. On a species per area basis, they contain more than any other conserved habitat in the UK. That's not to say that we should get rid of all of those conserved habitats and replace them with gardens, by the way, but they're still pretty undervalued. You probably want to know some of the ways that you can increase biodiversity in your garden, and you'll be thrilled to find out that none of them cost very much money or take very much effort, and you may already be doing some of them anyway. But just suffice it to say that your garden is already doing quite a lot for quite a number of different species, whether you know that they're there or not. So let's get into some of the ways that you can do that. Lots of them probably won't surprise you, but these are the ways that have been studied and they are known to increase the biodiversity in your garden. It's difficult to imagine it now, but 5,000 years ago Britain was covered in forest. There are estimated to be 1,700 species of insects that rely completely on dead wood, so it's no surprise that some of these are the most threatened in the UK. A huge number of beetles, for instance, that are threatened as a result of the fact that there just isn't anywhere near as much dead wood around anymore. So bearing that in mind, in the experimental gardens in the bug study that I described in the last episode, they put in some birch logs into some of the garden and just left them there to rot in log piles. And even though there were only one species of wood in there and they were only left for 2 years, they still showed a significant increase in the biodiversity that was in the garden just by leaving the birch logs there. In practice, you can leave tree stumps in, as well as woods from a variety of different trees, and some creatures actually prefer the dead wood to still be attached to the tree. If you're not sure whether it's safe to leave dead wood on a tree, then just get it assessed by a professional. And even if I haven't convinced you that it's worth worrying about the invertebrates that are in your garden, like the beetles and their pupa, then remember that the vertebrates eat those things and they rely on having them there too. But seeing as we're on the topic of decay, let's talk a little bit about composting. Gardens that had compost heaps had a greater abundance of wildlife all over the entire garden. Research from an organisation in Bristol found that you're much more likely to have slow worms and grass snakes in your garden if you have a compost heap, because they sometimes lay their eggs in there and they live in there because it's warmer than the rest of your garden, and they're reptiles and they're cold-blooded. You don't have to make perfect compost to be able to do this. So long as you've got somewhere where you're putting some of the dead plant material, then that's going to be enough to allow what are known as the detritivores, or things that feed on dead stuff, to be able to live there. If your garden's so neat and tidy that nothing can die there, then you're eliminating a whole group of organisms, and the organisms that eat those detritivores themselves, and therefore rely on them indirectly. I've spoken a lot about invertebrates, and I gave a good reason for that in the last video. But obviously stuff that helps invertebrates helps vertebrates too, because they're reliant on one another and they're very much connected. So another thing that helps all species is more in the way of shrubs and trees. A survey of British ornithology showed that gardens that had a greater abundance of shrubs and trees had more birds in it. The birds will roost in those trees, they'll eat the fruits and seeds and berries of the tree, they'll also eat the insects that are herbivores of those trees, and any of the dead wood, where the detritivores that we talked about, they'll eat some of the things that are in there too. It's not really that surprising. And when you consider that a greater abundance of vegetation leads to a greater abundance of all species, then there really is no reason to not have more in the way of shrubs and trees in your garden. A lot of the time you won't even need to go and buy these, because in British gardens you'll find seedlings of all sorts of shrubs and trees just turning up in your garden, from squirrels, birds, and wind just bringing them in there anyway. So if you just left your garden alone, it would be a forest within 10 years. So if you just leave some of those alone, there's some free plants that you can have, and that will dramatically increase the amount of wildlife that you'll find in your garden. Suffice it to say that if you increase the amount of vegetation in your garden, it's going to increase the amount of wildlife. In the next episode I'll talk about specific plants and how your planting choice can affect the wildlife that you find in your garden. I would have put it in this episode, but there's a lot of information there and a lot of research that's been done into it. They also noticed that if you feed birds in your garden, you're more likely to see more species of birds. which isn't that surprising either, but also that does select for people who are bird lovers, who are more likely to document the birds that they find in their garden. Anyway, if you are going to feed birds in your garden, just remember that different birds prefer different types of feed, so Niger seed, sunflower hearts, fat balls, and in a variety of locations, so from bird feeders, but also some birds prefer to be fed from a table. In the experimental gardens, in the bug study that I described, in 20 of the gardens they put in some of these bug hotels that they made. They made them with a variety of methods, some tin cans that they stuffed with paper straws, drainage pipe that they stuffed full of bamboo. This was one of the very effective ones, as well as sawn pine blocks that had a variety of hole sizes in it, from 10mm down to 4mm. In all 20 of the gardens that they put them in, they were occupied, and when they were put in sunny locations versus shady locations, the sunny locations were much more popular, and in them they found 2 species of solitary bee, both very good pollinators, and 9 species of solitary wasp, as well as 3 species of ruby wasp. Now, if by me saying wasp you're now worried that you don't want wasps in your garden, just remember that these are not the social wasps that try and eat your ice cream in the summer, although my dad did tell me that they never eat very much, so not to worry. They're completely harmless to people, often they're good pollinators, and lots of them are predators of garden pests, so they're very much to be welcomed. The ruby wasps live a very brutal lifestyle where they find the holes that have been occupied by solitary bees or solitary wasps, and then they lay their eggs in them and they parasitise them. But we're not here to judge lifestyles. We're here to support all wildlife, because we want all of the wildlife that comes to our garden, and we can be greedy about that. Oh, and the way that they measured it was in the autumn they would take these out and then they would put them into an unheated shed, undercover storage basically, and then they'd use an emergence trap and find what actually came out from them. In your case, you're probably just going to leave it there and then allow the hatched larvae to just go out and do its thing in your garden. So just suffice it to say, I've told you the experimental method, so if you want to go and look it up and refute it, then that's your prerogative, but we're not going to do that in this video.
Gardens that had ponds had more wildlife than gardens without.
Not particularly surprising, and every single garden wildlife book tells you to put a pond in your garden. However, the ponds that were in sunny locations had more wildlife in than the ponds in shady locations, and ponds with a greater degree of submerged vegetation had more wildlife in them overall. The vast majority of the ponds had frogs in it, and almost all of them had newts in them too. The pond certainly doesn't have to be massive, and in fact, in order to investigate the size of the pond,
They made some experimental ponds.
and they were about the size of a normal kitchen sink. And all they did was inoculated them with Daphnia, which are water fleas, which you should be able to get from an aquatic shop, but you probably can just inoculate your pond with some other pond water. And they put in a bit of Canadian pondweed. And this was shown to be really effective at increasing all the biodiversity in the garden, because I think what's important to say about ponds is that lots of the invertebrate life in your garden that has its adult stage as a flying insect, for example, often has its larval stage in your pond. So having a pond increases biodiversity everywhere in your garden, not just found in the pond. And something that really reduced the amount of biodiversity that was found in gardens was the use of slug pellets or pesticides. Not really that surprising. And if you're watching a video that's about wildlife gardening, then I'm sure you're probably not somebody who's using them all the time. But if your first urge is, when you see aphids on your roses, is to reach for the insecticides, I would urge you to allow the balance of nature to just do its work. There are so many things that eat aphids,
And they'll do a pretty good job of keeping their numbers under control if you just let them.
Now you may be thinking, well, this is all a little bit obvious. Why didn't you just save me the time rather than making a 10-minute YouTube video? You could have just done that in like a 5-second TikTok video. And what I really wanted to avoid was the temptation that is so often had by people by saying things like, gardens have a huge area of the country and therefore we need to use them to create more habitat that's like a conservation style habitat, and therefore you should garden in the way that I like to see things. I've noticed this from quite a lot of people who work or volunteer in some sort of conservation, and they try to tell people that there is a particular way of managing your garden in order to maximise wildlife. And actually the evidence shows that that isn't the case, and making fake bits of countryside in your garden, although they might be a fun project, and if you like that style, go ahead with it, but stop proselytising as though that's the only way that you can actually have a wildlife friendly garden, because it's just demonstrably untrue. And I think it's asking a little bit much to think that we could rewild the landscape using just our gardens. But what I wanted to make clear is that your gardens are valuable for wildlife anyway, and you don't have to make your garden look like a nature reserve. But also just to say about the limitations of how these things have to be studied. It's quite expensive to go and study lots of different gardens and set lots of different traps and collect lots of different bits of data from loads of different people's gardens over the course of 2 years. So naturally not all of it is studied in the detail that you might expect it to have been. So that still leaves a lot of room for personal experience, and remember that these studies were only ever done in one city in the UK, so it's not possible to say that these results are replicable on a global or even countrywide scale.
Next time, we'll talk about how native versus alien plants has been studied and its impact on wildlife, and the different types of plants that you might want to put in your garden if you want to attract particular wildlife, and how effective that's been shown to have been. I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and I'll see you in the next one.